So, indeed, today's talk is a piece of my book on Kant and the origins of the good will. In particular, it's part of chapter 3. And so if you find it interesting, I hope you'll pick up the book at the end of the year. So the origins of the good will, especially Kant's moral philosophy in the 1760s. Interpreters have long wrestled with or ignored the fact that Kant begins and ends the first and second sections of his Groundwork with a focus on the good will. And here I have in mind in particular passages 1 and 2 on your handout. I'm trying to start my timer here so I stay on time. All right. So Kant opens famously with the claim that it is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed beyond it, that could be considered good without qualification or limitation, except a good will. And then he comes back to this at the end of the second section. In this lecture, I will suggest that several clues to the significance of this fact might be found in Kant's early work in moral philosophy. That is, in his prize essay, observations, lectures, and remarks from the 1760s, Kant sketched a value-centric moral theory, focused on the kind of goodness that provides the necessity, validity, and motivation that could undergird obligation and necessitation. As he engaged Francis Hutcheson, Moses Mendelssohn, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as well as Alexander Baumgarten in the 1760s, Kant argued that the goodness or perfection of the will is the object of moral feeling, and that this goodness is the basis of the worth, honor, or dignity of humanity. And this goodness yields a principle and criteria for judging or determining moral action. Well, Kant's pure ideas of practical reason will soon displace moral feeling, and while his account of autonomy, self-legislation, and respect will emerge somewhat later, we might in the end consider whether and how the goodwill, which was central to Kant's early moral philosophy, might remain central in his later work as well. Section 1, the prize essay. One of Kant's first forays into moral philosophy is in the final section of his so-called prize essay, the inquiry concerning the distinctness of the principles of natural theology and morality, which he drafted in late 1762 and published in 1764. Here, Kant insists that obligation is central to moral philosophy, and that it should be understood in terms of an immediate ought that commands the action as being immediately necessary, rather than as a means to a given end. Unfortunately for the status of moral philosophy, Kant argues, this primary concept of obligation and the necessity that lies at its core are little known and lack distinctness and certainty. Earlier in this essay, Kant argues that metaphysics and mathematics are, in their own ways, capable of certainty, which is necessary to produce conviction, as are some parts of philosophical theology. But he contends, and this is passage 3 on your handout, he contends that while we may attain moral certainty of many judgments concerning the divine will, we lack the highest degree of certainty about them because some of the key concepts involved remain obscure. Rather than elaborate on any particular obscurity in the concept of the divine will in particular, Kant focuses instead on the obscurity of the relevant concepts as they're manifested in relation to human freedom. And this is passage 4, which I will read. In order to make this claim clear, I shall merely show how little even the primary concept of obligation is yet known, and thus how far practical philosophy must still be from furnishing the distinctness and the certainty of the fundamental concepts and the fundamental principles which are necessary for certainty in these matters. Before he highlights the lack of distinctness and certainty in our concept of obligation, Kant partially clarifies the concept. And this is in passage 5, which I'll read snippets of. That is, Kant distinguishes between the necessity of the ends and the necessity of the means, and insists that only the former, when expressed in the form, I ought immediately to do something else as an end and make it actual, only that can indicate an obligation. A rule and ground of obligation must, quote, command the action as being immediately necessary and not conditional upon a certain end. It requires an end which is necessary in itself. The difficulty comes when we realize that an immediately necessary end cannot be demonstrated by reference to some other presupposed end. Although reflection indicates, Kant says, that, quote, the rule, perform the most perfect action in your power, is the first formal ground of all obligation to act, and that it's a rule of the good, he says, no specifically determinate obligation flows from this principle without some account of perfect action. So this formal principle must be combined with indemonstrable material principles of practical cognition. The highest material principles of obligation, that is, can be identified, but must be absolutely indemonstrable because they cannot be derived from some other end or action. Kant claims in passage 7, for example, that love him who loves you, and relatedly, do what is in accord with the will of God, are such indemonstrable material principles of goodness, and thus of obligation, which are immediately subsumed under the supreme universal formula. Now, perhaps of greatest significance for the epistemic status of practical philosophy, Kant suggests, is that the source of the indemonstrable practical judgments itself remains in dispute. This is passage 8. It is yet to be determined whether it is merely the faculty of cognition or whether it is feeling, the first inner ground of the faculty of desire, which decides practical philosophy's first principles. Kant's conclusion in this final section of the prize essay is thus primarily negative. There are some significant unsolved problems in practical philosophy because the concept of obligation is poorly understood. Kant's case for this includes several claims about the importance of goodness to the concept of obligation. His argument depends on obligation involving immediately necessary action or perfect action, action with immediate goodness. He refers to the first formal ground of all obligation to act and of duties to refrain from acting as rules of the good and the universal rule of good actions. It's under these first grounds that we immediately subsume the material principles of immediate goodness, of certain kinds of action, and the immediate ugliness of other kinds. He claims that this kind of goodness is not well understood and emphasizes that these highest material principles can't be demonstrated, but probably at least can be decided by feeling. Significantly for his primary negative conclusions, Kant contends that feeling plays a significant role in determining the first material principles of goodness because they are indeed principles of the good, and our faculty for sensing the good is feeling. It's neither necessity nor universality require the use of feeling, that is. Now, as he reaches his conclusion at the end of passage 7, Kant notes that Hutcheson and others have, under the name of moral feeling, provided us with a starting point from which to develop some excellent observations. Something like Kant's own concern about the unclarity of the concept of obligation can itself be found in Hutcheson, who emphasized the various senses of the word obligation, and in passage H1, as he puts it, the many confused definitions given of obligation by no obscure names in the learned world. Indeed, Hutcheson also insists, and this is in passage H2, that the concepts of obligation and obligation to law can only be understood in terms of some absolute and immediate goodness, which must be perceived by the moral sense. In his own voice in this essay, as we've seen, Kant seems to endorse a few particular claims about immediate goodness. The goodness of requited love, for example, doesn't seem traceable to the necessity of some other perfect action or end, he thinks. And there is immediate, apparently non-derivative ugliness in the action which conflicts with the will of him from whom all goodness comes and to whom we owe our existence. And that without consideration of any consequences of disobedience. So these are two plausible material first principles, Kant's suggesting, principles of immediate goodness, and thus of obligation. But Kant does not propose any unified theory of this plurality of material first principles. Section 2, the observations. Shortly after completing the prize essay in late 1762, Kant began composing his Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime, published 1764. And this extended essay includes a brief but suggestive discussion of moral qualities. Although morality is not the focus of this essay, or even of this particular section of it, Kant does suggest that the principle for one's strict duties, higher obligations, and one's duty as a whole, as well as the ground or proper motive of virtuous action, can all be found in what he calls the feeling of the beauty and dignity of human nature, which is, quote, a general affection towards humankind. Kant carefully distinguishes between the motives and sentiments involved in different sorts of immediately pleasant actions, distinguishing between what he calls the supplements for virtue or adopted virtues and true virtue. While sympathy and complacence are both beautiful and lovable, he says, they're somewhat particular and limited in scope, and they're only contingently related to true virtue. In contrast, Kant emphasizes the sublimity of one specific feeling or sentiment, the feeling of the beauty and dignity of human nature. And this brings us to passage 9. True virtue can only be grafted upon principles, and it will become the more sublime and noble the more general they are. These principles are not speculative rules, but the consciousness of a feeling that lives in every human breast and that extends much further than to the particular grounds of sympathy and complacence. I believe that I can bring this all together if I say that it is the feeling of the beauty and the dignity of human nature. The first is a ground of universal affection. The second is a ground of universal respect. This feeling that lives in every human breast can extend universally, Kant says, to respond to every instance of itself, that is, to every human being. This feeling is an immediate ground of virtue and the source of virtuous action. It is the only feeling that is sublime and worthy of honor. It's a ground of affection as well as respect and esteem, and is directed at oneself as well as others. Acting on this feeling manifests the noble attitude that is the beauty of virtue, Kant says. Indeed, this feeling is important in moral practice because, quote, there are very few people who conduct themselves in accordance with principles, and it is so easy to err with these principles. Here, we also find Kant continuing to build upon one of the starting points, as he said in the prize essay, that one might find in Hutcheson. That is, Hutcheson attributes sublimity to the pleasures of the moral sense in particular. He identifies the moral sense as something to be encouraged and cultivated. And he also suggests that the moral sense involves the perception of an internal dignity and worth, even a perception of our own perfection. We find this in passage H3 from Hutcheson. Hutcheson writes, the moral sense, as it is the fountain of the most intense pleasure, so it is in itself constant, not subject to caprice or change. Each good action is matter of pleasant reflection as long as we live. These moral pleasures, do some way more nearly affect us than any other. They make us delight in ourselves and relish our very nature. By these we perceive an internal dignity and worth, and seem to have a pleasure like to that often ascribed to the deity, by which we enjoy our own perfection and that of every other being. It may perhaps seem too metaphysical to allege on this subject that the pleasures of virtue are the very perfection of this self and are immediately perceived as such, independently of external objects. Kant may also here be manifesting some sympathy for a recent observation of Moses Mendelssohn, who had insisted that in ethics, and this is passage M1, in ethics, one must become acquainted with the true dignity of the human being and consider the sublimity of the human being's ethical nature in the proper light. As an ancient philosopher put it, if someone has the appropriate respect for himself, then he will be all the more inclined to obey the voice of virtue. The shortest path to ethical depravity is to have a low estimation of human nature. With true humility in his heart, a person may be proud of the human being's dignity and of the rank which humanity occupies in creation. We must be something important in our own eyes, and what we do and refrain from doing must be of some significance if we are to espouse the cause of the good with zeal and energy. I suspect that Kant's remarks in the observations, that is to say, Kant's writing in the observations, is drawing on passages like this from Hutcheson and Mendelssohn. Now, given the immediate context of this essay on aesthetics and anthropology, the observations, it's not surprising that Kant does not lay out a comprehensive account of dignity and moral feeling, much less a full theory of moral conduct. What he does, however, is link moral feeling, motivation, and judgment with a particular, relatively unified object, that is, the beauty and dignity of the human being, and of concrete persons, not some abstract object or idea or principle. The most sublime objects of this mental power or capacity of feeling are each of its instances in concrete human beings and its manifestation in virtuous action. Even so, a variety of other human characteristics, including the so-called supplements and simulacra of virtue, not to mention other traits such as wit and taste and understanding, also contribute to the beauty and dignity of human nature, to which this feeling is sensitive. So, as Kant puts it, quote, the whole of moral nature displays beauty and dignity. True virtue requires this inward feeling for the beauty and dignity of human nature and a self-composure and strength of mind to relate all of one's actions to this as a general ground. This beauty and dignity and the capacity for feeling them are made manifest in the virtuous actions that they motivate. Kant goes on to claim that a person in whom this feeling of the beauty and dignity of human nature is dominant is virtuous from principles. Such a person acts in a variety of characteristically virtuous ways. For example, he treats his wife lovingly and with respect because she is his wife, and not just because she's beautiful, flattering, and clever. And he has a lofty feeling for the dignity of human nature. He esteems himself and holds a human being to be a creature who deserves respect. Now, Kant does not insist here that this be the only motive of a virtuous human agent, or that it's by itself sufficient for virtuous action. He does regard it as a distinctive and special sort of motivation, as we see in passage 10. But what if the secret language of his heart speaks thus? I must come to the help of this human being, for he suffers. Not that he is my friend or companion, or that I hold him capable of sometime repaying my beneficence with gratitude. There is now no time for ratiocination or stopping at questions. He is a human being, and whatever affects human beings also affects me. Then, his conduct is based on the highest ground of benevolence in human nature and is extremely sublime, an account of its unalterability as well as the universality of its application. That is, the feeling of the beauty and dignity of human nature is the ground for one's strict duties, higher obligations, and one's duty as a whole. And virtue is not simply a matter of following one's feelings or sentiments. It does require some reflection and generality, but it's not a matter of speculative rules and ratiocination. The dignity of human beings and the capacity for moral feeling, which is the primary bearer of the dignity in human beings, and whose activity is our primary mode of access to that dignity, these are central to the grounding and judgment and proper motivation of truly virtuous human behavior, according to Kant in the Observations. Section 3, moral Herder. Now, although Kant began teaching courses in ethics in 1756, the earliest lecture notes from students that we have from any of his courses in ethics are those taken by Johann Herder in winter 1763-64, which is just after Kant completed writing the Observations. And here we find some important clues as to Kant's developing views about moral motivation and moral feeling and goodness and the nature of obligation. The moral Herder notes begin with a rather Hutchesonian defense of non-self-interested feeling and motivation, followed by a somewhat Hutchesonian distinction between moral and natural goodness, with reference to the capacity for moral feeling. Free actions, Kant says, can be good in two different ways. Actions are physically good according to their consequences or effects, or morally good according to their intention. And he says morally good actions must be directed to a physical good, but they must not be measured by it. Free actions can be immediately good, make pleasure not as a means to an end. Moral perfection is moral as an end, Kant said, and not as a means, precisely in that it moves and gratifies us not through a relation to the effect, but rather immediately in itself. Yet, explicitly contra Hutcheson, Kant will go on to argue that the moral good and the immediate feeling of pleasure that is moral feeling are not exclusively tied to love and well-wishing for others or benevolence, as Hutcheson would have it, precisely because some actions toward ourselves are immediately approved of and are morally good. Kant, in moral Herder, is confident in the epistemic role of the capacity for moral feeling, at least if it's properly understood, and we see this in passage 11. Kant indicates that the starting point and the ultimate yardstick for ethics must be moral feeling, the capacity for taking pleasure in goodness and perfection. But still, a first principle of the good could help us distinguish moral certainty and truth from proverbs and prejudices and customs and the errant feelings to which they might give rise. But before he articulates a first proposition of the good, Kant engages with and offers three significant criticisms of the approach that he found in Alexander Baumgarten's ethics textbooks. Kant's lectures on moral philosophy were structured as a loose commentary on Baumgarten's two textbooks, The Elements of Practical Philosophy and Ethics. First, Kant raises a technical issue with Baumgarten's definition of ethics as the science of internal duties. Kant complains that defining ethics as a doctrine of duties and of virtue would be appropriate when considering only human beings, but it's imprecise and misleading as a matter of definition because it improperly excludes higher beings whose ethics are not concerned with obligations or virtue at all. And this we find in passage 12. Now, while this criticism is somewhat technical, it underscores Kant's ongoing commitment to thinking of moral goodness as broader than and prior to obligation and virtue and their distinctive inner struggle. Second, Kant complains that Baumgarten also, and this is passage 13, Baumgarten always wrongly supposes the broad concept of obligation, to which he ascribes merely the motive of usefulness, in an improper understanding of ethics. For since one only performs a morally good action who does it from principles not as a means, but as an end. That is, Kant proposes that obligation, in the strict and only proper sense, must be understood in terms of a distinctive motivating ground that must be drawn solely from noble, virtuous, free choice. Third, Kant takes aim at Baumgarten's two major rules of ethics: perfect yourself as to the end and as to the means. Kant complains that these rules are either speaking of moral perfection, in which case the ground of the principle is simply presupposed and not articulated, or their meaning is indeterminate and unstable. Kant insists that Baumgarten's ethics, which is otherwise, quote, the most substantively rich and perhaps the best of his books, completely misses the distinction between physical feeling and moral feeling, and the crucial distinction between moral goodness on the one hand and physical or generic practical goodness on the other. It's at this point that Kant insists that the first principle must indeed be a principle of moral perfection, but it must be a basic rule and indicate its ground rather than just presupposing it. Whence Kant infers that, quote, this is passage 14, the sole moral rule is this: act according to your moral feeling. Now, it's not clear precisely what Kant has in mind here. This formulation does underscore Kant's claim that the capacity for moral feeling is our first or best source for cognizing moral goodness. But in context, it's also hardly an endorsement of naive introspection about individual cases. Rather, it seems to emphasize Kant's insistence that moral feeling must play a role that some theorists would mistakenly ascribe to reason or the understanding, that is, in identifying middle or high-level moral principles, such as those in favor of love or obedience or gratitude. Kant also goes on to suggest that moral feeling should play a grounding role in action. That is, moral feeling seems to refer not only to a feeling of approval for the moral motive that we could use to identify it, it may also be part of the moral motive or incentive or ground that is approved, or of the approval that may be acted upon. This immediate feeling of pleasure is pleasure in one's own moral perfection and the perfection of one's action, which is the motive. And some of Kant's formulations, I think, support this suggestion. For example, 16 and 17 on your handout. Moral perfection is moral as an end and not as a means, precisely in that it moves and gratifies us, not through a relation to the effect, but rather immediately in itself. And the immediate pleasure in free actions is called moral feeling. Kant's critique of Hutcheson further confirms this suggestion about the relationship between moral feeling, moral motivation, and the moral principle. That is, Kant objects to Hutcheson's account of the proper moral motive, especially when it comes to actions directed immediately to ourselves. That is passage 18. Some actions immediately directed to ourselves, without being directed to usefulness as means, but rather from immediate goodness, can be morally good. Kant contends that neither Hutcheson's conception of self-interest nor his talk of love and well-wishing for others can properly account for this. Rather than Hutcheson's merely beautiful ethics, and this is the second half of passage 18, rather than Hutcheson's merely beautiful ethics, Kant insists on a true earnest morality, or an earnest strict ethics, in which, quote, our human dignity and greatness ought to be the incentive or motive. This seems to be an elaboration of at least half of that claim in the observations in passage 9, that the motive and principle of action in virtue is the feeling of the beauty and dignity of human nature. Now, what seems most novel in the moral Herder lecture notes, compared with the observations and the prize essay, is Kant's emphasis on the distinction between natural moral feeling and custom or artificial feeling, an emphasis that Kant borrows from Rousseau, whom he invokes 10 times in the moral Herder lecture notes. These Rousseauian contentions, like those we find in passages 19 and 20, add significant cultural, historical, and anthropological detail to the observation's claims about the human feeling of the beauty and dignity of human nature, and highlight the inner worth of the common human being, and emphasize it over counterfeit virtue and less valuable human traits. Section 4, Kant's remarks in the observations. After the publication of the Observations book in 1764, Kant used his personal copy of that book as a notebook for collecting a wide range of thoughts. In these remarks from 1764-65, we see Kant isolate the goodness of the will as the locus of the worth, honor, or dignity of humanity. And this suggests a way to Kant of articulating the principle and criteria for moral action. In several passages in the remarks, Kant refines the account of the relationship between goodness and obligations that he had outlined in the prize essay back in our passage 5. That is, he suggests that morality and categorical necessity, as well as moral obligation, must all involve an action good in itself that involves a special sort of goodness found in immediate and inner moral grounds, in the ground to will the good, as he puts it in some remarks. However, even when the remarks pertain to moral philosophy, they are primarily concerned with moral feeling and perfection and goodness, rather than obligation or necessitation in particular. On a page inserted into the observations discussion of the feeling of the beauty and dignity of human nature that we've already mentioned, Kant famously remarks on Rousseau's focus on the common man, and this is passage 21. One must teach youth to honor the common understanding for moral as well as logical reasons. Rousseau has set me right. I learned to honor human beings, and I would feel by far less useful than the common laborer if I did not believe that this consideration could impart a worth to all others in order to establish the rights of humanity. Now, as becomes clear from the immediate context and the broader context of these remarks, as I hope to suggest, and in accordance with moral Herder, Kant goes on to identify the particular honor and worth of human beings with their morality and moral feeling and capacity for virtue, which involve acting on a distinctive moral motive. That is, rather than with scholarly capacities or artistic capacities or accomplishment or sympathy or love of honor. which he also discusses in the remarks. In the remarks, Kant takes it to be evident from experience that human beings have some inner immediate motivation to perform actions that are good in themselves. He says, there is no immediate inclination at all to morally evil actions, but certainly an immediate one to morally good actions. And this is an immediate ground to morally good actions, the immediate sensation of morality. Reflection on our experience of moral feeling reveals something about its object, that it involves an immediate pleasure in ourselves and our activity, specifically in the perfection and perfect activity of our free will. While recognizing there is in general a distinction between recognizing a perfection and appreciating it and then acting on its basis, Kant notes that there's a particularly intimate connection between recognition, appreciation, and action when it comes to the perfection of our own free power of choice. And this is passage 22. Immediate pleasure actually lies in the possible exercise of our power to promote another's well-being. Experience teaches that a human being in the simple state regards the good fortune of another with indifference, but that if he has promoted it, then it pleases him infinitely more. The ill fortune of another is commonly just as indifferent, but if I have caused it, then it mortifies me. Likewise for another if he has done it. And as far as the participatory instincts of compassion and being well disposed are concerned, we have cause to believe that these are merely great strivings to ameliorate the ills of others, derived from the self-approbation of the soul, which brings forth these sentiments. We have gratification in certain of our perfections, but far more if we ourselves are the cause. Most of all, if we are the freely acting cause. To subordinate everything to the free power of choice is the greatest perfection. And the perfection of the free power of choice as a cause of possibility of the good is far greater than all the other causes of the good, even if they would produce the actuality of the good. The particular feeling of immediate pleasure, of gratification or approbation or appreciation that Kant identifies here involves a cognition and appreciation of the goodness of our own free power of choice. A perfected will experiences moral pleasure in its activity, yet the pleasure expected to result from its action isn't the aim or the internal ground of the perfected will or its activity. The greatness of this feeling indicates that this is the greatest kind of perfection, the greatest goodness. And our cognition and appreciation of this goodness in ourselves can itself lead us to do and cause and produce good. According to these remarks, I'm suggesting the proper object of moral feeling is neither the effect of our actions nor some distinct sentiment or motive, such as enlightened self-love or sympathy or pity or benevolence. The proper object of moral feeling is the perfection of the free will itself and its activity. This is the greatest perfection. And this perfection of the will, Kant suggests, is the internal moral ground. The good will acts from this goodness. The will is perfect insofar as, in accordance with the laws of freedom, it is the greatest ground of the good in general. I'm sorry, this is passage 24. The moral feeling is the feeling of the perfection of the will. That Kant claims that the moral goodness of an action is determined not by its consequences or utility, but by the perfection of the free will that performs it. But how are we to specify and judge a good will or a good action? Or perhaps more importantly, how does someone with a good will act or decide how to act? Kant wishes to uncover something about what he calls how freedom in the proper sense, the moral, not the metaphysical sense, how freedom would be the supreme principium of all virtue and also of all happiness. And his answer is not that we should just naively follow our current feelings, even our apparently moral feelings. He has more to say. Along with his contention that we already have seen, that a goodwill subordinates everything else to its own goodness. Kant proposes a heuristic criterion for judging the categorical goodness of an action and a free will. He suggests that one simply needs to apply the facts to moral feeling by considering the same action in others or putting oneself in the place of others in order to help cognize a goodness possible in itself. This is what he explains in passage 25. One can see that truthfulness does not depend on philanthropy, but on the sense of justice, through which we learn to distinguish what may be done from what may not be done. This sense, however, has its origins in the nature of the human mind, through which one judges what is in itself categorically good, not useful, not according to private benefit or benefit to others, but rather by considering the same action in others. If in that case there arises opposition and contrariety, then the action displeases. But if there arises harmony and consensus, then it pleases. Hence, the capacity to put oneself into the place of others is a heuristic means to morality. Indeed, we are by nature social and could not sincerely approve in ourselves what we criticize in others. The common sense of good and evil is the criterion of good and evil. The goodness of the will as a free principle is cognized not insofar as such forms of private or public utility arise from it, but rather so far as it is possible in itself. And less heuristically, and with less appeal to the particularly social nature of our sentiments, Kant goes on to suggest that the possibility in itself of an action, or of a good free will performing it, can and should be judged in terms of a possible universal will that does not contradict itself. And this we find in passage 26. In another remark, he says, an action, when considered from the perspective of the general will of human beings, if it contradicts itself, is externally morally impossible, that is, impermissible. Now, to some degree, these particular remarks certainly anticipate, by 2 decades or so, aspects of the Groundwork's famous formula of universal law: act only according to that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Just as appeals to the dignity or worth of humanity and of subordinating everything to the goodwill anticipate aspects of the formula of humanity as an end in itself in the ground. But significant for present purposes in the context of the 1760s are that Kant introduces his heuristic proposal as an articulation of categorical goodness and of the goodness of the will as a free principle, and how he proceeds to explain it. That is, Kant makes no particular appeal to a notion of law or reason here. The criterion for what a perfect will would do, for what it is even possible for it to do, is what it could approve of, which needs to be that which could be universally approved of. So it must exclude everything that contradicts itself when considered universally. In the context of these remarks, I think categorical goodness is the inner moral ground, and this goodness is what Kant takes to warrant the criterion of generality or universality. This is a heuristic and a criterion because it enables us to make proper use of our will and moral feeling, and to subordinate everything else to the honor and dignity of ourselves and others. It is this immediate goodness of a good will that explains why certain actions are immediately good and categorically necessary. Now, Kant also notes briefly that for human beings, such goodness involves sacrifice and self-denial, which are essential components of human virtue and duty and obligation and necessitation. He emphasizes that this is part of our human station in creation. But he does relatively little in the remarks to flesh out these particular dimensions of obligation. And as in the Observations on Moral Order, Kant also has quite modest expectations about actual human behavior, indicated, for example, in passages 27 and 28. We must assume that others have at least a partial moral goodness or remnant of the good in them, but this is far from genuine virtue. He suggests that parents and religious doctrines must take care not to deploy punishments or rewards in a way that preempts the immediate or internal grounds of moral goodness from becoming manifest. But even when the internal grounds of moral goodness are active, they will often be insufficient to move us. We typically need some appropriate supplementary motives for virtue, as he suggests in passage 29. That is, human beings are not naturally capable of achieving a holy will, Kant says, but there is some goodness in our will that we can feel and that has some power to motivate us to action, at least to perform common duties with some inner moral beauty. And the appropriate supplements for virtue must be secondary to and may themselves presuppose the presence of some such inner moral goodness and beauty in the agent. These are necessary complications for the categorically good action of finite good wills. So in conclusion, what we find in Kant's moral philosophy of the 1760s is a value-centric theory. The immediate or categorical goodness of actions and the dignity or worth of human beings, or any persons with a free will, are all central and fundamental to his account. Immediate, absolute, and categorical goodness, which he identifies with the goodness of the will, is the object of moral feeling. And this comprises the inner moral grounds, the moral motive. And this suggests the criteria for moral judgment. It's these value concepts and properties that undergird the concepts of obligation and virtue. Obligation and virtue presuppose the goodness of the will, along with some potential for resisting it, and typically the possibility of some supplementary motives. Altogether, given what we've seen, it's not surprising, I think, that in a classificatory sketch of rival moral theories from the late 60s or early 70s, we find Kant explaining in passage 32 that his preferred system is, quote, the doctrine of the power of choice subordinated to the essential laws of the pure will. It is the agreement of all actions with the personal worth of oneself. So, while Kant's pure ideas of practical reason will soon displace moral feeling in 1770, and while his account of autonomy and self-legislation and respect will emerge somewhat later in the mid-1780s, we might consider whether and how this goodwill, which is essential to Kant's early moral philosophy, might remain central to his later work. Thank you.